I am Seth Cluett. I'm moderating this upcoming panel of three people, all of whom are immensely impressive in their accomplishments and inspirational in their acts. And I am pleased to welcome Abby Aresti, Hannah Kai, and Lauren Hayes to the conference this afternoon. In the interest of maximizing time, maximizing slippage of time at the ends of presentations, and maximizing questions at the end, I will jump straight to biographies, and I will do all three bios right up front so that we can sort of have in our mind some of the stuff that people are doing as we're talking, hearing from each of the panelists. So forgive my reading, but I'll do my best to not fub up. Dr. Abby Aresti is a sound artist, composer, and educator. Aresti's site-specific installations have been featured in local and national news outlets. Paths 2, The Music of Trees, a temporary installation in Seattle's Washington Park Arboretum, was featured in an interview with Melissa Block on NPR's All Things Considered and was hailed as otherworldly and sometimes eerie, sometimes transportingly lovely by the Seattle Times. Aresti has presented her research in the United States, Canada, Australia, and Hong Kong, in conferences including the ICMC, Balance Unbalanced, Isaiah, and Sonic Environments. She's held fellowships at the Studio for Creative Inquiry at Carnegie Mellon University, Grinnell College, and the Acoustic Ecology Lab at Arizona State University's Herberger Institute of Design and the Arts. Aresti is technical director and lecturer for the Technology in Music and Related Arts, or TAMARA program at Oberlin Conservatory, where she was the Bonner Center for Service Learning's 2019-2020 faculty fellow. In 2019, in collaboration with the Oberlin Center for the Arts and Oberlin Conservatory, Aresti founded Girls Electronic Arts Retreat, or GEAR, a 5-day STEAM summer camp for 3rd to 5th grade girls hosted in the Tamara Studios. Abby will be our first speaker today. After that, she'll be followed by Hannah Kai. Dr. Kai holds a BA in early childhood education with special education approval from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and an MA and ED in curriculum and teaching from Teachers College, Columbia University, just up the street. Her research focuses on multicultural social justice approaches to early childhood education with a focus on science and engineering education. Her professional experience includes work as a kindergarten and 2nd grade teacher, student teaching supervisor, and instructor in graduate courses on inclusive pedagogy and curriculum development. As a professor in the Department of Interdisciplinary and Inclusive Education, Dr. Kai teaches courses on social and emotional development, on diversity, access, and equity within early childhood systems. The panel will end today with Lauren Hayes, who's a musician, improviser, and sound artist who builds and performs with hybrid analog and digital instruments. She is assistant professor of sound studies within the School of Arts, Media, and Engineering at Arizona State University, where she founded the research group Practice and Research in Inactive Sonic Arts, or PERIEZA. I've never said that out loud, actually. I've read it many times, but her research centers around embodied and inactive music cognition, inactive approaches to digital instrument design, interdisciplinary improvisation, and haptic technologies. She is director at large of the International Computer Music Association and a member of the new BBC Radiophonic Workshop. Her 2020 release, Embrace Superpang, was included in Bandcamp's Best Experimental Music of February 2021. It helped me get through the pandemic, and she was an Artist of the Month with the Huddersfield Contemporary Music Festival in April 2021. So I just want to welcome all of our panelists and say thank you for taking the time to come and listen to them, and I'll turn it over to Abby.
Great, thank you. Let me just go ahead. Can you see my screen all right?
Yes,
Good.
totally.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. My thanks to Suzanne and all the organizers for creating this space for discussion on belonging in electronic music, all of the presenters today, and for sharing your incredible work. And I'm very excited to hear from my co-panelists, Hannah and Lauren, very soon, whose work has been very inspirational to me as well. And many thanks to Suzanne for the invitation for being here. Let's see. Speaking of collaboration, before I get started, I wanted to acknowledge that the work that I'm sharing today is very much collaborative. the students in my undergraduate research lab, the crafting sound lab, are instrumental in creating this work. And I particularly want to acknowledge the contributions of Rachel Gibson, a graduate student at University of Virginia, and who's the assistant director of GEAR, whose work is very instrumental to what you'll be seeing today. In the context of today's broader conversation about accessibility, I'd like to share background examples, reflections, and notes on future research and broader applications of a project we first launched in 2019, the Girls Electronic Arts Retreat. The Girls Electronic Arts Retreat is a summer camp for 8 to 11-year-old girls with any level of technical or creative background. Hosted by the Technology and Music and Related Arts Department of Oberlin Conservatory, GEAR uses sonic arts and crafts to foster curiosity in science, technology, engineering, arts, and math, or STEAM disciplines. The STEAM acronym, introduced in 2006 by Georgette Yackman and championed soon after by John Maeda, formalized the integration of art into STEM education. STEAM education emphasizes integrated learning, making intentional connections across disciplines through skill and knowledge building experiences, creativity and play, as well as constructivist and constructionist pedagogies. In the late 2000s, several DIY STEAM-oriented approaches to electronics education were introduced in quick succession. Published in 2006, Nicholas Collins' book, Handmade Electronic Music, inspired a new generation of musical hardware hacking. In 2007, the introduction of Leah Beakley's LilyPad Arduino sparked an explosion of e-textiles experimentation. Over the past decade, both communities have grown significantly. The Kobakant Collective and e-textiles Summer Camp continue to grow the e-textile community. And the latest edition of Handmade Electronic Music features new chapters by artists introducing various DIY techniques, including e-textiles, illustrating important intersections between these two communities of practice. In recent years, artists, musicians, and educators have built programs integrating music technology and STEAM, including co-panelist Lauren Hayes' Sound, Electronics, and Music Project, what we just heard about Techni's incredible workshops, and the Mini Gem STEAM Summer Camp, among others, which have all provided wonderful inspiration for GEAR. GEAR was first launched in summer of 2019 with an in-person session. GEAR 2019 lessons were structured around a 5-day camp session, with each day running from 9 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. Lessons explored a primary theme. Morning and early afternoon activities provided scaffolding for a featured project in the late afternoon, which was presented to families in a brief showcase. Camp themes included creative topics like listening, acoustic ecology, chance-based composition, and musical texture and gesture, among others. Technical skills introduced included field and studio recording, DIY electronics, audio editing and processing, analog synthesizers, as well as basic coding. Among others, plans included a day devoted to building interactive tangible sound maps, a day exploring chance-based composition through technology, enhanced sonic twister boards, and a third plan, which we called Inkling, which invited participants to use contact microphones to create and play graphic scores in real time. In our sonic cartography lesson, participants developed 2 interactive paper sound maps. The first is a small postcard-sized map of a local park at the site of a sound walk from a previous day. Participants add copper tape and LED stickers to light field recording locations from their walk, and they also print conductive ink arrows to point to these same locations to trigger sound playback. Later, groups collaborate on large pushpin activated world maps. We invited them to imagine that their maps represented a parallel world, and they added new names and colors to the front of the map and helped us hook up copper tape and pushpin activated switches on the back of the map, and added process sounds collected from freesound.org to embed in their maps. You can see a picture. Our sonic twister lesson plan explores chance-based and algorithmic composition with and without technological mediation. In the morning, participants compile lists of sounds heard in teachers' previous improvisations. The group assigns sounds to different spin results, and participants take turn playing twister and notating results, and a teacher performs the score generated from the game. In subsequent variations, participants assist in musical realization of the twister scores after the fact, or perform alongside the game in real-time, as spin results are called. Later, participants use chalk markers to add graphic notation to the twister boards and vocalize these sounds as they place their foot or hand down on each drawing. The plan culminates in the creation of interactive twister boards. Participants use modular synthesizers to record a collection of sounds that match illustrations on their twister boards. Copper tape is routed from the boards to makey, and computers to trigger sound playback via touch. So each twister board is functioning as a score, a game, an interface, and the group performs for family members at the end of the day. You can kind of see what that looks like there. So the Inkling lesson plan was inspired by a composition of mine by the same name, which explores the raw materiality of found objects through the real-time creation of a graphic musical score. Objects are affixed to contact microphones, dipped in paint, and then moved across the surface of a blank piece of paper to create the score. The lesson's technical learning objectives included teaching each participant to use field recorders, build solderless contact microphones, and to complete real-time audio processing using Ableton Live. Creative topics included listening, graphic notation, and musical gesture and texture. And Philip Bay's lesson plan incorporated activities to address each of these topics in turn. Oops, skip over there. In developing our lessons for year 2019, we took many things for granted, and this became especially apparent when in 2020 we had to move to remote instruction due to the pandemic. So things like access to shared resources and technology, the ability to troubleshoot and fix the technology ourselves when things went wrong, as well as peer-to-peer collaboration amongst the students, which was much easier in person, of course. So to support remote learning, for year 2020, we built a special website, illustrated instructional guides, video tutorials, and homemade kits. The camp was designed as a 4-week program with synchronous Zoom meetings and self-paced asynchronous activities. Year 2020 introduced electronics through solderless sound circuit building, and projects included the Cyborg Octopus synthesizer, the Apple amp, and the Orange synth. In planning the remote session for year 2020, we recognized that we'd be faced with many challenges, including campers' different levels of access to resources, ranging from parental time and supervision to material supplies, and as well as past relevant experiences. In preparing for our curriculum, we defined several constraints, including that we would provide all the necessary tools and materials, that we would create electronics projects that were aesthetically appealing, that emphasized circuit trace visibility, and that were simple enough for campers to complete with parental supervision, even if the parents had no relevant experience. Before their first circuit synth building activities, participants completed introductory electronics projects. These included reading an illustrated electronics glossary, guide, and comic from our zine, as well as participating in a resistor race and other physical activities that taught participants about different electronic components. You can see some of those activities there. So the first circuit building activity, synth circuit building activity, was the Cyborg Octopus synthesizer. The synth is an octopus crafted out of a sock. A light sensitive magnet activated 555 timer circuit is embedded atop a small styrofoam wedge inserted into a plastic globe, which serves as the octopus's head. The circuit is made from electronic components and copper tape, and the lesson introduces electronic components, circuit building, and troubleshooting, as well as oscillation, feedback, and sound. It's a relatively easy to assemble project that encourages participants' enthusiasm for electronics, and they activate their octopuses by holding a magnet nearby to switch on power and use a flashlight to change the circuit's pitch via a photoresistor. And hopefully this won't be too loud, just a very quick. So get the kind of idea of that. The first camper who was able to get that working immediately started translating for their octopus, which was really cute. Oh, let me see if I can. Okay. Next, they build an Apple amp. The Apple amp is a simple hobby amplifier built around an LM386 chip using the schematic found in Nick Collins' handmade electronic music. It's a solderless battery-powered amplifier designed in the shape of an apple. The circuit is made out of copper traces, a custom vinyl sticker substrate, and electronic components. A clear vinyl sticker with a printed circuit illustration may be laid over the circuit to assist in assembly and insulate traces. Before circuit assembly, the Apple amp circuit sticker trace is affixed to a large piece of styrofoam. A small piezo disc is attached to the Apple on the styrofoam using push pins and copper tape. In blending craft, technology, and sonic experimentation, our Gear 2020 Apple amp presents a multimodal authentic integration of STEM and arts. Participants build the Apple amp using step-by-step instructions with little room for deviation. But once built, they affix the Apple amp circuit sticker and contact microphone to styrofoam and embed found objects in the substrate, activating objects by hand and listening to the resulting sounds. The Apple amp framework facilitates experimentation, observation, iteration, and discussion. In turn, this activity supports interdependent creative and technical learning objectives. For example, in our design process, sometimes we created inadvertent feedback loops, which offer entry points to further technical and creative investigations. So, quick demo from one of our teachers. Kind of get the idea for that. Oops, sorry. Apologies, just getting a little out of order here. Okay, there we go. Lastly, we built an orange synth. The orange synth is a dual purpose, touch sensitive, solderless synthesizer and electromagnetic circuit sniffer. I'll play this video while I continue so you can see it being assembled. It is an adaptation of the LM386 hobby amplifier circuit used in the Apple amp, built with copper tape, craft foam, and a custom screen printed conductive ink coil. The interface has no traditional interface parts like buttons or knobs, which encourages campers to touch parts of the circuitry, creating new electrical connections. This undermines the stability of the original LM386 amp design, causing the hacked circuit to function as a low-file tactile synth. In addition, the circuit is highly sensitive to electromagnetic interference and is great for electrical walks, where a participant uses a pickup coil, an amplifier, or orange synth to listen to hidden electromagnetic fields in their environment. And this is almost done, so that's finished playing. And then you just assemble the circuit on top. And I'll play a quick, very brief thing here, kind of the range of sounds. And I'll just let you hear the electromagnetic circuit go. Okay, oops. Okay. In 2019, our lessons made use of shared resources available on campus, including computers, software, analog synthesizers, field recorders, makey-makeys, and shared labs, including a recording studio. We encouraged peer-to-peer collaboration and planned ambitiously since teachers were on site to troubleshoot projects. Despite benefits, this limited the accessibility and portability of the activities. In contrast, custom kits designed for Gear 2020 supported working from home. While these activities were more portable, development processes were resource and time intensive, limiting growth potential. While COVID-19 impacted Gear 2020 lesson plan design, pedagogical and thematic approaches across campus iterations were inherently different. While Gear 2019 lessons emphasized creative concepts like musical listening, graphic notation, texture, and gesture, technical concepts were introduced but not emphasized. Technology was used first and foremost to support multimodal learning activities that reinforced creative concepts by making them more audible, tangible, or visible. Technical concepts, on the other hand, were a central focus of Gear 2020. We employed crafting techniques and materials to make circuits easy to assemble, issuing breadboards for their opaque conductive connections and soldering for reasons of safety and accessibility. However, while crafting techniques were central to Gear 2020, these were employed to facilitate the teaching and learning of STEM concepts. Purely creative concepts were incorporated through playful listening activities, but these were adjacent to rather than authentically integrated into the STEM activities. In reflecting on differences across 2019 and 2020 camp iterations, we developed a framework for the design and implementation of teaching interfaces for musical expression. Our framework prioritizes accessibility and integrated learning. We define accessibility in relation to a project's user friendliness, availability or portability, approachability, attainability, and adaptability. It informs the design of the project itself, its build processes, and the introduction of each project in the context of a broader lesson plan. Integrated learning explores authentic multimodal experiences across STEM and arts disciplines. In future project designs, we'll keep the broader framework we have developed in mind, emphasizing art and STEM integration and accessible project design. Future research will also emphasize student-centered projects with greater creative freedom and student-centered assessment. We will embed assessments within activities to evaluate the effectiveness of our pedagogical approach and to support an iterative educational design framework. In future research, we also intend to explore effectiveness of camp materials and inspiring interest in STEAM disciplines. If you'd like to see more photos of the Girls Electronic Arts Retreat, you can find them on our website. And just briefly, in conclusion, I would say, for me, one of the broader implications of the work on the Girls Electronic Arts Retreat, as someone who teaches in higher ed, has been its impact on how I think about teaching and learning technical and creative concepts in the college classroom. While it might seem odd to equate lessons designed for 8 to 11-year-olds with those designed for college students, I think hybrid technologies provide both unique affordances and challenges for all ages. And so this semester I'm teaching a new course on mixed media circuits, and I'm experiencing these affordances and challenges right alongside my students. And it's important to note that the combination of 2 or more highly skilled disciplines, for example, textiles and electronics, does not necessarily create an easier practice. Furthermore, the lo-fi technologies and techniques characteristic of projects like the Orange Synth can be quite unstable, affording, on the one hand, learning opportunities, but also not insignificant frustrations. Nevertheless, students of all levels seem genuinely enthusiastic thus far about the possibilities afforded through the recombination of different materials, technologies, and techniques, and I'm excited to see what they create. Oh, whoops. That's a little light going, and many thanks.
Wow, that is terrific. And you're done early, which is a miracle, and thank you. So I just have one question before we go on to Hannah, but because I think we're going to save most of the questions to the end, but one that might help sort of foster that is, how are you handling sort of instructor education, right? Because you seem to embody all of these technological skills in one human being. I would imagine the people you have working with you come with at least 1, maybe 2, but not maybe all 5. So right. I'm just curious how that process has been for you as you brought these things online.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very insightful question. And I wouldn't say that I necessarily embody all of these. I feel like I'm often learning from my students. I have students who, I'm coming from the sound, background, and I have students who have way more textile background, for example, and have been guiding the way for me with sewing lessons and what have you. So we learn from each other, I would say, very much in the lab. A lot of the students who teach the camp are coming from the lab, and I'm essentially handing them off. And so I have students who are more focused in electronics and students who are more focused on textiles, and they're able to collaborate and work together in the context of the lab, both to teach one another and to, we assembled 30 Orange Synths last spring for an e-textile swatch exchange, and that was a learning process in and of itself. And then during the camp, I would say it was very interesting to note that I sent my teachers all of the equipment, and I said, oh, go ahead and assemble this. And I thought, they've got the instructions, it'll be fine. And they found it actually much harder, I would say. They were impressed when the 3rd to 5th graders were able to assemble, because we went step by step with them and their parents, and my students. I did not give them the benefit of that sort of step by step guide, so it was definitely a learning process there. So
yeah, that's wonderful. And apologies, I in anticipating Hannah's talk, I flipped names between Abby and Hannah, so apologies on that. So I want to go on actually to Hannah Kai, and I'll give the floor over to you. Thank you, Abby.
All right, thank you. I think this should work. Are you able to see that?
Looks great, thank you.
Okay, great. My name is Hannah Kai. I'm an assistant professor of interdisciplinary and inclusive education at Rowan University in New Jersey. I'm honored to gather here with these great thinkers. It's really amazing to hear all day about the amazing work being done in electronic music. I come from a different type of technical space, and that's maker education. I came to making and tinkering as a former elementary science teacher. So that's me up there making contraptions and stop motion animations down at the bottom, and up at the top building models for cities of the future with my students. Now I teach courses in STEM education, and I fold all of that into the work of preparing teachers. The goal for this presentation is to identify issues of belonging in makerspaces, and then we'll consider ways to advance our practice through a culturally responsive framework. And these strategies are adaptable to a variety of technical fields. I'll start with a brief introduction to the maker movement. Making is an extension of DIY culture, or do-it-yourself. It encourages the creation of new and unique applications of technologies. You can see some of the typical interests in this word cloud: electronics, robotics, as well as woodworking, textiles, paper crafts, so kind of more traditional activities. People can encounter electronic music through maker spaces. Some spaces include audio recording workstations, music apps, sound projects. And I mean, Abby just took us through a whole bunch of amazing projects that could be done with sound as well. The maker movement has experienced phenomenal growth and made its way into classrooms, including a corner of my own classroom when I was just a spring chicken teaching 3rd grade. Two driving forces of the movement are Make Magazine and Maker Fairs. Their increased visibility has made an impact on mainstream formal education. So with these spaces popping up in schools, museums, libraries, and community centers, students increasingly encounter making as a context for learning science and engineering. The Institute for Museum and Library Services, or IMLS, has invested over $10 million in grants on maker spaces and maker programming nationwide. Much of the funding for this is based on the idea that because these spaces encourage participation and engagement, that they're inherently more equitable. This assumption underlies the proliferation of makerspaces aimed at students. So let's take a look at the offerings of one makerspace, which happens to be my local library, and it's a pretty typical example of what you'd find. And let's unpack that assumption that more makerspaces will make STEM more accessible. So first, as you're looking at the offerings here, you can think to yourself, what kinds of making are legitimized in this space? So we're thinking, where are there opportunities to see tools, resources, histories, experiences of students of color or from low-income families? Some scholars have critiqued the movement for its narrow focus on what they see as white middle-class males and their interests, in particular the rise of accessible digital tools and rapid prototyping devices like 3D printers has kind of lent a techie edge to many makerspaces. And the second question of belonging is, what pedagogies occur in these spaces? Is our focus really on these tools and materials and the stuff in our technical spaces? And how can we turn attention to the facilitation, the interactions, and the teaching and learning practices? Now, I was not just calling out my library. I love that place. Questions of belonging have been underexplored throughout the movement. Make Magazine has been one of the many driving forces. And at the 3rd annual FabLearn conference, Dr. Leah Beakley shared her analysis of every Make Magazine cover since its first issue. She found a very narrow definition of maker activities. Of the 40 people featured on covers, 85% had been men and boys, and 0 were people of color. More recently, an annual survey of makerspaces found that the leaders and members of these places are overwhelmingly Caucasian. This brings us back to our questions about belonging. Who is fostering belonging in these spaces, and whose making is legitimized in these spaces? On the left, you'll see that less than 1/3 of the members of makerspaces are women. On the right, you'll see the same goes for leaders, whether those are teachers, librarians, or museum educators. Of course, as the maker movement grows in formal schooling, we find that the issue of belonging isn't just affecting people's hobbies or their free time interests. Makerspaces are influencing STEM education at a moment in time when there's great concern about inequality in science and engineering. Who has access to qualified STEM teachers and to community resources like makerspaces? Which students feel like that seems like a space where they belong? These questions are essential because research has shown that a strong sense of belonging leads to higher motivation, academic improvement, better physical and emotional health. But rather than changing the status quo of belonging in STEM, we're actually seeing the same patterns of exclusion. So more makerspaces has not meant more access for many groups of people. Scholars have explored this concern in different ways. In their lit review on making and tinkering, Vasui and colleagues found a dearth of public discussion around issues of culture and equity. They state that equity is not only a matter of broadening access, but it lies in the how of teaching and learning. So in other words, the practices matter, the pedagogy matters. Blickstein argues that those who facilitate making must be prepared to consciously merge rather than exclude or replace students' social values and expertise with the practices of inventing, tinkering, and constructing. To foster belonging, projects must be deeply connected with meaningful problems, either at personal or community levels, and designing solutions to those problems would become both educational and empowering. Gutierrez and colleagues pushed the conversation of access and accessibility forward by arguing that making and tinkering are indigenous to non-dominant communities. Creativity is a fundamental human practice. They argue that we must counter narrow definitions of making and makers to recognize and leverage connections between the scientific and the everyday. I share these statistics and ideas to make the case that a pedagogical framework is necessary to advance our work. It's essential to turn attention to the human interactions within this movement and provide a core knowledge base for facilitators of technical spaces. So whether you're here today as a collaborator, a mentor, or one of our speakers, you are a facilitator of learning. You are either primarily or occasionally a teacher. So I'll be talking about our work as teaching practices or pedagogies. Here you can see the tenets of culturally responsive pedagogy, or CRP for short. It's a teaching approach, a pedagogy of belonging. It shifts attention away from the physical materials and the stuff of teaching, and it requires us to ask, who is facilitating the learning? How are we building community? How are respect, worth, and value communicated here? To share some background on this approach, culturally responsive pedagogy has been used in education as a framework to understand and disrupt structural racism, including the use of ethnocentric curricula, disproportionate suspension of children of color, and teachers' low expectations of students of color. Now, if you're at the symposium, it's likely that you use equity frameworks in your work. So we have the theory, we've done the groundwork, but it helps to have a start in applying that equity framework to everyday practice. This next section zooms into equity-oriented approaches to maker education, which can help inform and advance our work in a variety of technical spaces. As an example, in Hawaii, a museum educator, a native Hawaiian artist, and teachers at 2 elementary schools partnered to learn about the stories of Maui and traditional Hawaiian kapa kite making. Now, if you think about those CRP tenets on the left as our objectives, we can use this example to fill in the right column with one accessible way to advance our work. We can address this first tenet of CRP by viewing and sharing examples of making from a variety of cultural perspectives, including contributions of different ethnic groups. Attending events like today's symposium is one way to develop this knowledge base. The museum educator, artist, and teachers designed a series of 8 maker and science activities for students who were predominantly Pacific Islander. And this example speaks to the second tenet of CRP. We can encourage our collaborators, mentees, and participants to draw webs of connection, making specific connections to participants' cultural backgrounds and communities. With my teacher candidates, this always involves having them interview their young students and families, so they have some background knowledge to inform instruction. In another example of equity-oriented maker education, this is a series of workshops by the amazing Dr. Natrice Gaskins, where she led youth in making environmentally and culturally relevant art installations using science and musical technologies. She grounded this work in Native art and invited Native Taos students and families to participate. In our own practice, we can identify ways to make spaces and events welcoming to families from diverse backgrounds. I have a really big heart for children's literature, so for me, this always includes displaying diverse children's books during maker programs and integrating opportunities to read and discuss them. The culminating project for this maker experience was a light and sound projection piece on a historically significant chapel in the community. And a Taos elder was invited to speak as the highlight of the event. For this fourth tenet of CRP, we can design sustainable systems for including the input of diverse families. In my work, this means inviting community members to be co-planners of our programs and experiences. This final example is from a youth participatory ethnography. The educators began with students' concerns and encouraged them to identify community problems linked to systemic oppression. So decaying infrastructure was linked to limited street lighting, police brutality linked to the need for protection, youth concerns linked to bullying. The students developed innovative solutions. They developed prototypes for light up sneakers, an alarm backpack, an anti-bullying app, and they presented their perspective on these issues and their solutions to community members. Clearly here, the teachers positioned youth with agency and power to contribute to the improvement of conditions that affect them on a daily basis. This example speaks to the fifth and final tenet of CRP. We can prepare and use examples from participants' lives with specific attention to marginalized ethnic groups. These were all powerful examples that have continually inspired my work, and I hope they do the same for you. In closing, the issue of access in makerspaces is not resolved through the funding and creation of more makerspaces. It can only be resolved through fostering belonging, and this requires explicitly recognizing the maker capacities of racially, culturally, linguistically diverse participants, and strengthening our view of traditionally marginalized learners as capable creators and problem solvers. In particular, a culturally responsive framework can guide the development of pedagogies of belonging and allow best practices to accumulate and advance. Thank you for having me here today. I'm looking forward to the rest of our panel and the rest of this symposium.
Hannah, thank you. Uh, Super wonderful and very important work you're doing. Also done early, which is again remarkable. So I'll take this as an opportunity to pose one question to you as we get ready to transfer to Lauren's presentation. I was really struck by your statement about using one of the Taos elders to speak at one of the maker conferences or the maker events that you were putting on. There's a local group here in Harlem called Ladies of Hip Hop that is working with the Guggenheim to do intergenerational knowledge transfer of club dancing styles within the Black community in Harlem. And one of the aspects of that has been joint dance lessons where there's knowledge transfer from elders in the community down to younger dancers in the community, which is a really amazing thing to watch happen. And I'm curious, have you had any experience with this sort of, there's this hierarchy of kind of technical learning as primary and craft learning as secondary or less than in technical education. And I just wonder, have you seen projects or have you thought about the potentials, or do you have ideas for how highlighting intergenerational transfer of sort of craft-based indigenous knowledge systems might be participant in maker projects, things where it might not be a separate act of high-end technology, but one of shared technological expertise on an equal plane?
That's a good question. And I do want to clarify that I was highlighting the work of other scholars. So that particular project was by Dr. Natrice Gaskins, who was just fabulous.
Thank you for the clarification.
Oh yeah, but I mean, the project that you mentioned also sounds amazing. So when I found a challenge in my work is having the families see themselves as being the educators when they're invited into schools. So yeah, definitely something to keep striving for and working towards. But it has really been a challenge to have the parents recognize, when we're inviting you to come in and co-plan with us, we're not trying to like put a curriculum on your shoulders. We're really inviting you to, share your perspective and what you'd like the children to learn about as well.
That is wonderful. Okay, so we are at our last panelist, Lauren Hayes. Lauren, happy to hear from you.
Great, I will just share my screen. Okay. Great. Hi, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you all virtually today. And first, thanks again to Suzanne and the Heyman Center and everyone who's helping to run things behind the scenes for inviting me to participate alongside all the inspiring speakers that we've heard from today, and to acknowledge the amazing work of my co-panelists. I feel that a lot of what I'll say is echoing many themes that we've heard about so far. I'm going to talk briefly about two projects involving electronic music that might be useful for our discussion. One from primary education and one from my undergraduate teaching, both of which involve improvisatory, interdisciplinary and embodied approaches within their practices and pedagogies. Like many of us here, I wear many different hats. I perform live electronic improvised music with instruments that I create from hardware and code. This involves both solo performance work as well as collaborations with many different types of artists, many of whom you'll see in the slides today. I teach electronic sound and music related courses in the Interdisciplinary School of Arts, Media and Engineering at Arizona State University, working with both grads and undergraduate students. And I also have a background in more public-facing work with various communities involving technology, sound, music in a variety of settings, including schools, daycare centres, workshops, and with arts charities working with people with complex needs. So if we're talking about access and accessibility on this panel, I want to start off by acknowledging that all these different ways of conceiving electronic and belonging in electronic music continuously form and shape what I do, and I don't think of these practices as distinct and separate, but rather as very much related, integrated, mutually supporting ways of living musical lives. And we've heard similarly from many people already today. And in a similar manner, and I'm also thinking about Suzanne's use of praxis in the title of this symposium, as a researcher, my methodology is creative practice research, where I see a reciprocal relationship between theory that I draw on and my own practice. Most of my writing on sound and electronic music is grounded in and informed by literature from embodied and enactive music cognition, mainly because these have been the most useful ways of thinking about what I do and continuously open up new possibilities for where my work might go. This nascent field offers an anti-representational framework for understanding musical activity as both corporeal and culturally situated action. And there's not time to dive into this fully today, but to speak very generally, it supports the idea that musicking, as we all know, is not something that just happens in our heads, but that musical meaning emerges, or that we make sense out of the ongoing dynamic and physical interactions between, say, listeners, their environments, musicians, performers, and so on, and with the materials that we use to do this. So the spaces we make music in, the people or other beings that we make music with, perhaps enabling technologies as well. And proponents of embodied perspectives and enactive approaches posit that cognitive processes are deeply rooted in our physical, bodily, sensorial engagements with the world, and therefore our highly specific and individualized capacity for these interactions based on our unique physiology, history, social environment, identity, and so on. This occurs over a variety of different time scales, from immediate engagement with materials, instruments, to interpersonal, microsocial, perhaps performing together, to larger timescales of genre or institutions or generations, and so on. So to say something about the title of this talk, Beyond Skill Acquisition, this is sort of speaking to a very commonly cited model of skill acquisition from Hubert and Stuart Dreyfus, which, when applied to musical practice, and as is often discussed in musical cognitive science research, particularly with improvisation, musicians are sort of seen on this continuum where they mature from novices to experts, who eventually, when they're playing, achieve this state of what many describe as mindless flow. But in his work attempting to deal with issues of scaling up the enactivist model from simple action perception processes to more complex cognitive phenomena such as imagination and memory, philosopher Sean Gallagher has argued against the Dreyfus model, saying that situated or embedded reflexive thinking is a skill as much as this physical coping is as well. And following this, I've argued that discourses and pedagogies that focus only on aspects of technical development, or in particular virtuosity, do not adequately account for the variety of dynamic relationships that are reified during musical play. So the case studies that I will discuss next demonstrate that through the lens of and practices associated with live electronic musical performance, improvisation, and in fact perhaps any kind of musical activity, these activities don't need to be framed within this novice expert model at all. Rather, we can think about how musicians' knowing emerges from their experiential histories of interactions with many different materials and objects, perhaps digital media, spaces, as well as social roles and group dynamics. Specifically, this makes evident that the knowing experiencing of musicking does not depend on markers necessarily of skillful musical instrumental expertise at all, but rather than the instantiation of multiple sensitivities of the person as a whole. And this has really been evidence over the last 15 years of my work with interactive computer systems for improvisation, working with numerous different collaborators, community groups, and so on. So the first example that I'll discuss was a large-scale project that took place in 2014 and 2015 called Sound, Electronics and Music. Thanks, Abby, for mentioning this earlier. Your work also inspires my work greatly. But in 2013, I was completing a PhD in electronic music and haptic technology and doing a lot of different music-related freelance work. And a woman called Nancy Douglas, who was the arts coordinator from West Lothian Community Arts, a council area close to Edinburgh in Scotland, saw me give a workshop on electronic music history and laptop performance with school children, and asked me to consider if I could create a course on music technology to run in primary schools in Scotland with whatever budget I needed, what that might look like. So I had to think about not only the content of this project, but what were some of the prevalent issues in music technology pedagogy and why early education might be important. So in the UK, for example, many music technology higher education courses are maturing and are well established. The number of courses in the history and practice of electronic music worldwide continues to grow. So how can and should they evolve? And at around the same time, Georgina Bourne and Kyle Devine published their often cited study of higher education in the UK institutions from the 90s onwards, which called for careful reflection on what's at stake in how we design these courses in higher education. So what factors will shape future relations between music, gender, race, ethnicity, and social class. Looking at the schools I'd be working in, all the schools were government funded. They all use the same technologies. They use laptops for teaching with smart interactive boards. Students were using these in the classes, but despite all this at the time, the music teaching only revolved around traditional music education, theory, oral skills, notation literacy, and instrumental training. And also it seemed that given that a lot of technology was being marketed to young children around that time, such as Little Bits, for example, there was clearly a technocultural space in which to develop a pedagogical approach. So here's a really brief summary of the projects. Sound, Electronics and Music was a 10-week programme. It was funded for 2 consecutive years from Creative Scotland's Youth Music Initiative, which is aimed at providing high-quality musical activities for young people in Scotland. It's lottery funded. It involved around 900 8 to 12-year-olds in 16 schools. We ran 16 one-hour weekly workshops in 8 schools, 2 per school per week. We also worked in 2 additional support needs schools who received all the same course materials as the other schools. So children may attend these for a variety of reasons, including learning environment, family circumstances, disability or health needs, and social and emotional factors. And I designed the curriculum and asked a different musical practitioner to join me each week. Each guest was given the freedom to contribute a unique perspective and set of skills. So we had musicians who were working with electronics, both within academia, students, as well as professionals. In addition to the large number of workshops given, this produced 4 new software applications designed in Max MSP, which were distributed and remain on laptops in the schools, along with a box full of lovely sound equipment. So the aim of the project was to harness this potential for accessible music education that would engage students regardless of their musical and class backgrounds. If they hadn't had access to formal musical training, how could we inspire creative exploration? But of course, pupils who were receiving musical lessons were encouraged to bring their instruments to class so they could use these and expand their skills through experimentation, extended techniques, improvisation, augmenting with electronics, and so on. And because it was so exploratory, there was very little modification to be inclusive in the additional support needs schools. We used the same materials, but were perhaps more flexible in how these things were delivered, allowing more time for exploratory play. And the use of narrative was a really helpful device here, as it can be used to thematize the weekly sessions. The project also acknowledged that while, there's a myth that young people have this affinity with technology, It's not a universal phenomenon. I was looking at the UK, research was supporting that, not everybody has access to, say, a laptop, again, related to class status. So we tried to design the course to work with technology that would always be available in the class, as well as using low-cost hardware, found materials. As I mentioned, we had the box full of equipment that was left in the schools. And we also wanted to use things that could be developed outside of the classroom, so things that could be bought online in hardware stores, low-cost items. Also, a lot of the students, even though we were working with such a young age group and we weren't doing coding in the class itself, even though we were showing and using some pre-made software devices, they asked how they could further investigate this. So of course we point them to open source software such as Pure Data and Chuck. And there was a manual left in all the classes developed with lesson plans, detailed descriptions of how to connect all the hardware and provide instructions for running everything. Of course, we know that teachers have to be supported, particularly when most of the course material was new even to the music teachers. So we ran continuing professional development training outside of the scheduled class time. Although out of the 32 classes involved, only one teacher had previously worked with any of the technology that was being used. This was a Makey invention kit. And one other teacher was in the process of developing a secondary school higher education, a secondary school music technology course. So it was all really new. And it was important that they could not only repeat but expand and apply, but as Seth just mentioned, having full long-term institutional integration beyond just myself and my collaborators as facilitators was crucial and the most challenging aspect, which of course requires more work and financial support. So really quickly, the course design, we scaffolded the learning, building upon each week's learned skills and vocabularies to create a sense of continuity from week to week. So we developed listening skills and bodily somatic awareness, vocabulary to talk about sound, then moving on to recording sounds, and then perhaps making instruments, hacking, improvisation, small ensemble and full class collaborations, but always sort of allowing enough space within this curriculum for flexibility, allowing agency from the students themselves so they would bring in their own sounds or instruments or objects or materials, all kinds of weird and wonderful things turned up in our classes. And we wanted to facilitate embodied learning where possible and playful exploration of electronic music, rather than necessarily a model where they sit behind 20 laptops, which for a variety of reasons wouldn't have worked in these schools at this age. So I'll play this 1-minute montage, which includes a collaborative class composition as a soundtrack using self-recorded sounds, which was composed collaboratively in Max MSP. Okay, I'm going to jump on in the interest of time. So I'll turn now to how these ideas have influenced my teaching within the digital culture undergraduate program here in Arizona State University. So we're here designed to tasked to design courses that can appeal to students from a variety of backgrounds and disciplines. They encourage research-led teaching, and on approaching improvisation with technology from a pedagogical perspective, I had to consider how could improvisation be successfully incorporated into this undergraduate program as a way of making sense of both digital technologies and digital culture. How could this be approached from an inclusive interdisciplinary angle, given my strong background in live electronic music? And what could be learned about the role of improvisation in relation to music research within the cognitive sciences, particularly when working with people who are being introduced to its practices for the first time? Also, how could this all be approached from the cultural diversity of the students within our programme? While I'm talking, I'll also show some images and videos from previous years of my interdisciplinary improvisation course. It's now in its 6th or 7th year, so you can see images here of an augmented reality improv ensemble. So we draw on different areas of live electronic music research, such as laptop orchestras, network performance. The class also explores the idea of collaborative instruments, where, for example, 30 individual laptops can be used to control parameters within one main sound-making software instrument. Again, here the interesting dynamics appear not out of the individual physical virtuosity, but in how many to few mappings affect the sonic result, or how agency is distributed throughout these human-machine systems, how performers can perhaps subvert rules that are set up within any established system. Other elements of the class include experimental strategies for incorporating more than one discipline, such as, for example, amplified painting using contact mics attached to canvas, or using gestural controllers to create both visual material and at the same time manipulate digital sound. The largest component of assessment is via final class performances, which are collaborative group improvisations, and these have included to date a vast range of materials and media techniques, including food, cooking, coming back to our theme, augmented reality, and breakdancing. So students are motivated to find their own personal and culturally situated responses to creative challenges by being guided through a series of scaffolded techniques. We begin again with music and movement-based improv practices, and the class works to develop collaborative multimedia performances. So instead of being another course where students learn a new technique or creative coding environment or software, we critically explore the technologies they are learning to use in other classes, perhaps through a practice-based creative sense making. We ask questions such as, what sorts of things can easily be translated between artistic disciplines? How can techniques from electronic music performance practice be incorporated into this task? What's the role of documentation in all this, and can it become part of the performance itself? So we have non-time-based arts coming into this, such as photography or using social media within the improvisations. And before attempting to improvise using instruments or other technologies, we work through techniques such as Pauline Oliveros' deep listening methods, or well-established free improv exercises. So John Stevens' click piece, for example, which can be performed on body percussion, objects, acoustic instruments, and of course, electronic and digital instruments. So it kind of levels the playing field in a way. In the case of this simple exercise, there's a potential for a class of 30 untrained improvisers to co-create a compelling performance in a very short amount of time, often producing, say, characteristics of swarm dynamics. So not only is sensory motor exploration involved, but musical meaning is brought forth through this emergent, extended kind of cognitive network that involves these complex relationships between the improvisers involved, technology, and the space in which this is all happening. And we can take the enactive proposal seriously by developing and augmenting improv practices that collectively build on individual musical and creative and social cultural histories that individuals bring to the table. So I'm trying to look at, what do the students already do, what are their backgrounds, and how can we find ways to facilitate new forms of collaborative expression through this. So one example we can see here was a trio that emerged during the course. It was a Persian dancer practitioner who performed while wearing low-cost hand tracking system, which in turn controlled parameters of sound being produced by two musicians. So one had built her own hybrid acoustic digital percussion instrument using self-taught woodworking techniques, using piano strings that could be plucked or hit or scraped, and the other was performing using an augmented electric guitar. So this repurposing or co-opting of tools has been a practice long used by both improvisers and electronic musicians. So the performance was relational not only through the usual modes of nonverbal communication, such as eye contact and gesture, as well as, of course, listening. And the particular sounds being made would affect the dancer's movement, which in turn would directly process these sounds in real time. And I'll just give one more example. So this was another larger group that comprised live projected drawing, Bharatanatyam dance techniques, and several custom-built electroacoustic instruments. In this group, continuous adaptation to numerous auditory and visual cues demanded kind of sophisticated behavioral coordination by the group. And some of this may have been highly visibly gestural to the audience, other elements were not. This couldn't be compared to other types of ensembles, so it's likely that no other kind of identical assemblage has existed. And as someone who's not trained in dance, I couldn't assess this work purely from the perspective of technique alone. Yet, these types of interdisciplinary improvisations demonstrate that complex and at times highly compelling and highly expressive unfolding of creative activity can be co-articulated between multiple performers, many of whom wouldn't have classed themselves as musicians or improvisers. So it's a very messy, non-linear versus purely technical, linear, skill-based perspective. So to conclude, I'll just emphasize by saying that embodied approaches that I'm talking about, they're not solely about physicality, but rather thinking about how to incorporate the richness of ways of living and improvising musical lives that might be possible through our own uniquely and social-culturally situated musical histories. And rather thinking about technology, as others have mentioned today, as necessarily innovative, or to echo Hannah's comments earlier, as necessarily inclusive, perhaps we can use these practices involving electronic music broadly imagined and broadly configured as a way to explore, critique and engender how technology might afford such musical possibilities. Thank you.
Lauren, thank you so much. Just, by way of housekeeping, remember if you have a question, feel free to post it in the chat. If you'd like to ask your question out loud, you're more than welcome to do so. Just make sure to let us know in the chat that you'd like to do that. But I want to start off. We'll see if we can get the all three presenters back in gallery form. Here we are. Terrific. Okay, so I want to start. The temptation is to start by and we'll get there with what are the biggest impediments for your project. But I want to go the other direction first, which I think is maybe more where we're headed conference-wise and also as a field. What are next steps for you with the project that you presented, and where would you take it were you to have no impediments, not necessarily even be roped to your current institution, your sort of pie in the sky utopian version of where your project goes? Because I think it's important. Most of these things, right, are driven by vision, right? Every one of these projects, every one of these research streams comes from a place of a desire to affect social change through direct action. And I think that comes from a place of vision at the start. And I'm just curious now that you've sort of manifested some of these things in situ, where you're headed with these projects, and where would you take them if you could take them anywhere? Yeah, Lauren?
I think for me, what I'm trying to always get at is, and I'm thinking about a lot of sort of feminist scholarship looking at, I'm thinking of, for example, Marie Thompson and Annie Gold's Sonic Cyberfeminisms, which is thinking about how do we think about, access and accessibility and this idea of representation versus structural change, and not saying necessarily that one needs to exist without the other. I think my goal with all these kind of things is just how we configure electronic music practices in general outside of academia. So seeing and evidencing the kind of successes of these projects, and we can of course talk about the failures and the work that needs to be done as well. And then going into, I suppose, spaces, particularly in my solo performance out in the world and doing shows, and how there's such a kind of gap between these rich possibilities of how we can do music versus the way that electronic music is so widely configured in a lot of spaces. And I think that's always a sort of goal. So personally, I'm making sure that I take my work into many different kind of spaces and try to kind of demonstrate that, you know, there's a variety of approaches of doing things. I think that's really key for me. So how that kind of grows, I think, is really non-linear, but that's always the kind of goal with this, to sort of open up what this can look like, what this can mean, you know, feeding into the other projects that are in my work that I've not spoken about today, you know, working with many different community groups, and thinking about how musical expression can be engendered through electronic music practice that is not what we necessarily see on the stage.
Right, great. Hannah or Abby?
Sure, I'll chime in. So my current work is with teacher education students, and my colleagues and I have been speaking about developing a graduate program that's focused on STEM, particularly for early childhood educators, and really coming at it from starting with that social justice perspective and being sure that, you know, as our teachers are encountering pedagogies of science and engineering, you know, they're really thinking about how can we start with the families and start with the children's experiences. So that's kind of the next layer of where we'll be going.
Great. Abby?
Yeah, so for me, I think the experience of having run Gear only 2 times so far, in 2019 and 2020, in a fully in-person and then fully remote version, has been really impactful in thinking about sort of next steps. And the question of accessibility, I think, came to the fore in reflecting on those 2 iterations. And so looking ahead, I think sort of where we're at is thinking about this, I don't know how to both, and, you know, how can we have the best of both worlds, and how can we develop you know, projects and materials and curricula that are able to support you know, both sort of in the context of the camp, but then are also easy to take out into the world, to the classrooms, because you know, one of the things I've been so inspired by the Sound Electronics Music Project, Lauren's work, was this question of, you know, leaving the educators with materials, right, to be able to actually continue that work. And I've, you know, done some professional development events and found that, you know, there is often that disconnect. It's not necessarily like the types of things that we're doing don't necessarily translate well to the classroom. So working on bridging that gap, I think, is something that I'm very inspired to work on going forward.
Yeah, that's totally true. You know, Suzanne suggested at one point that I mentioned some of the work that we're doing here at the Computer Music Center around accessibility, inclusivity in technical studio design. So trying to think about how to develop a classroom architecture that makes the room welcoming to everyone, but also limits the friction points that make people turn around and leave an electronic music classroom. And I think that one of the biggest friction points that we've seen in each of your papers has touched on this, is sort of why I decided to bring it back in, which, you know, there's a kind of pioneer patriarchal sink or swim mentality in electronic music and computer music. Pedagogy studios, like I remember my undergraduate studio, like nothing was labeled. You went in, you figured it out. And like the ones who are kind of like Darwinianly able to get past the kind of absolutely hostile engagement with your first, you know, reel-to-reel machine or, you know, synthesizer, that you're then able to kind of be part of the club, and it has that attitude about it. And I think something that each of you talked about that is of crucial importance is this idea of lay knowledge, expertise, and maybe public displays of expertise in technical spaces. How do you think about, you know, each of you are rebalancing what expertise means and how you approach expertise in these contexts. So how do you lower barriers where there's an implied expertise required as a ticket to entry.
I might jump in just because, so my day job as a technical director in the studios is very much about, about the sort of setting up the space and thinking about, how can we make a space feel welcoming, and several spaces, we have many different types of studios. And so, we've spent with students, mind you, I involve the students very closely in developing physical as well as digital materials to sort of make the technology less sort of intimidating, but then also it's also about like the type of technology that is welcome in a space. So we now have 4 craft cutters out in the lobby, and other types of technologies that I think are useful to think about how they might inform the types of practices that embody a space or inhabit a space, I should say.
Yeah, that's great. Hannah or Lauren, any thoughts? If you don't, that's cool.
Yeah.
I can go another direction. Hannah, go ahead.
Oh, sure. I like to think about different access points for students. So when I work with, when I do maker programs for preschool children and their families, and my students are facilitating, we're always talking about what would be a really easy way for a kid to jump in here. There's a table of squishy circuits. Maybe it looks kind of intimidating, but if they have a chart paper where they have put a question in the student's home language and an example that could be a drawing, that way the kids have a really easy way to come over, start a conversation, find out what is happening in this area. And then I know this isn't always possible, but for us, having translators at the tables was really essential. And just, talking to them about the pedagogies that we're using, inviting families over, and kind of like modeling for families what's happening.
Yeah. Great.
I think I just want to add that I think a lot about the way you phrased perhaps barrier to entry to what, and I'm sort of thinking about looking at my students that are wanting to go out in the world to do this, and what kind of world is it that they're going out into in terms of the social environments that are required, being able to find financial support to do this kind of work. So I think that's something that I'm thinking a lot, and maybe perhaps struggling with where I am right now with this, having performed a lot outside academia for many years. What are the types of environments that I'm trying to lift barriers to, actually?
Sure.
Yeah.
No, that's absolutely critical, I think, because there's a temptation, I think, in the kind of positivist, teleological, neoliberal education system to believe that the goal of school is job, and that the goal of accessing technology at school is vocational training for job. And for us, and for many of your projects, embedded in the project seems to be a belief that like a heartfelt belief that engagement with these ways of thinking, with these ways of moving bodies, with these ways of engaging with the world, creates different mental pathways that helps people think outside of the constrictions and frameworks that weigh on us. I think heavily about the difference between the Columbia Makerspace here on campus and the Barnard Design Studio. In the Columbia Makerspace, when you walk in the space, which is a very like concrete floor thing where the whole center of the room is filled with all of the technology you get to use. The Barnard Design Studio, when you walk in the door, the whole center of the room is collaborative tables, and the technology spins the boundaries of the outside of the room. And I think often about like how much institutional power speaks through the places where we engage in these kinds of activities, right? And so many of your projects are kind of dismantling that to great effect. Suzanne, I just want to make sure we are now past the 5:15 on my clock, and I know Brad's slated for 5:30. How would you like to play the next little bit here?
If you want to continue the conversation for another 5 minutes or so before we flip the script, I'm happy to do that.
Sure. I certainly
I don't have a whole lot to say either, Seth. So.
Okay.
That's not good advertising, Brad. Come on.
Yeah.
Well, it's very deep stuff then.
Okay, great. We're going to go for short and deep at 5:30.
I'm curious, Suzanne, if you have questions, also feel free to chime in, and Bonnie and previous panelists. I think we can kind of open things up.
Yeah, absolutely. If anybody wants to come on board, I'm more than happy to include folks in this conversation. And I applauded a little bit about what Lauren was saying in that, and when you were talking about, what is the end goal, or what is the next step, and something that I think about in terms of what we're doing is that, and I see possibility for and possibly shared motives in what you all are doing, is that I don't want to reproduce the pipeline for the Silicon Valley. Okay, like that is not our goal, to provide jobs for students when we're making these workshops, and it is not our goal. Actually, we're looking, to have a completely different effect and a complete reimagining of what these technologies can and do in our lives through the different relationships that are engendered in the environments that we create. So there's a little bit of mystery in terms of what are we doing going forward, because I don't necessarily know. I feel like that is going to be conducted by what continues to emerge out of these environments. Yeah. Sorry, just chimed in there.
Yeah, no, totally right. Totally right. Go
ahead, Seth. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, maybe I'll ask my kind of unfortunately negatively framed question, which is, in the things that you've all tried to do, and Suzanne and Bonnie, I would include you in this as well, right? I think in general, people want to fund working with K through 12 students on tech things. Generally speaking, there's not a paucity of money for that kind of activity. So instead of thinking about money or time, like, what have been the biggest impediments to success for projects that you've seen? Like, what are the pain points that, there's 38 people on the call here, that they would look out for if they were trying to start up an initiative like this on their own? Like, what are the moments where you're like, if that would only get out of my way, I could push this further? You can start with money if it's easier to get going.
Interestingly enough, Lefray and I were talking about this yesterday. Interestingly enough, the barrier can be preconceived notions or a not understanding of the students of what we're doing. We found that if we didn't collaborate with other institutions, we would not get the enrollment in our workshops that we got, because a lot of the students that we're trying to reach do not intuit that they belong in that environment, and that they would have something to learn or gain in that environment. So that was something that we learned very fast, that we needed to collaborate in order to actually reach people. Because we were just gonna fail. We were like, I can't justify spending thousands of dollars teaching 4 students. So I felt like that was a barrier that we hit very quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it sounds like what you're saying is that there's something to like the inherent socialization of people to feel excluded. So why would they find you in the first place, right? And so that's a huge thing. Yeah. Other folks?
Oh, sorry. I think the interdisciplinary thing comes into this. So I've found that, and it sounds like this applies to everyone that's just presented in this panel, is how we're framing it. And if I teach a class on, I don't know, if I call my class like Intro to Max MSP, right? It's just gonna stop a lot of people taking that class. Right. And interdisciplinarity comes with its own whole set of issues, of course, as well. But even in the projects in schools, that seemed to be one of the ways that the teachers were really engaging with the work. How could this technology then be applied not only in music lessons, but also to like science classes and theater and all, you know, repurposing all the technology. So it seemed like that was a solution to kind of developing the infrastructure for this work, both in the schools and also teaching in academia. I found my courses that are, I mean, they have to be interdisciplinary because of where I am, but the more they are, the more diverse the students that are taking them seems to be. So that's, you know, that's something that's been useful to think about.
Yeah, I mean, especially for all of the educators on the call, like we did what Lauren's saying about the about syllabi and course descriptions and titles. Like at the CMC, at the Computer Music Center here, we did a wholesale rewrite of all of our course descriptions and our titles to make them reflect a more diverse population. And it's not for any reason that anyone maliciously had a course description that was flat or overly technical. It's just that they hadn't been touched in years and years and years. And so to try to first modernize and then in the process of modernization, making sure that people see themselves in the course descriptions alone, you know, like I incorporated, just as a silly example, like I incorporated in my electronic music history class, which is non-denominational and not hierarchical, classical or pop, hyperpop in the course description. And it made trans students feel seen, right? And like, I'm not saying that because I believe it. I'm saying it because a couple of them called me out on it. They were like, I can't believe that you're talking about, you know, Charlie XCX. Like that's not this is great. We're here and we're real, you know, and that's a wonderful thing. Other folks, there's nodding and like further examples. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would just echo everything. Definitely is true to my experience as well. First, regarding the courses, my mixed media circuits course has a really diverse enrollment. And I think it's partly a collaboration thing because it's part of a broader learning community with art history, looking at making historically. And so now I have, 10 art history majors also in my course who might never have taken it otherwise. And then also to the point about sort of collaborating to get sort of the younger students, definitely, going into, for some reason I've had good success collaborating with choir teachers, going into the course, setting and doing electronic music for a few of their classes. You reach so many more students than just kind of going it alone. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. I have one more observation, I think, maybe before we hand it over to Brad. So I noticed over the course of all of today's stuff that that there were programs working with K through 12 students, and there were classes that address college students. And I wonder, there's an institutional structure to the K through 12 education that implies we're on a mission to affect change broadly across lots of different kinds of people in lots of different kinds of places, outside and within institutions, right? And then for the folks who are working with classes at university, they're relatively focused on, this is a class that opens up this thought space, but that, getting the message out past that class to affect large scale change at the university level. That's the thing, I see all of these wonderful examples all day long of K through 12 education, which is amazing. But for those of us in higher ed, trying to think about how to develop systems to change the people who are going to go out and be the next generations of teachers in the near term, right? Like we're planting the seeds for change with younger folks, but we're also training the next generation of teachers. So how do we bridge that gap? What's the connective tissue between those two, ways of approaching this issue?
I will say that there has been a major rise of maker-teacher education in elementary ed, early childhood ed. So find a teacher educator, and because they're looking for you all you talented, brilliant people, because this isn't necessarily our space. So the ideas that you bring in, or, if we're able to visit a space or see a program or an activity that you've done, whatever small amount we can gain is helpful.
That's great. Any other thoughts before we wrap up?
I think that's a great place to end, frankly.
Super.
I mean, you know, it's such a complex question and thoughtful too. I think we're all probably it is an interesting and important question for all of us, and I feel like it's another panel, Seth. So just
Yeah.
note to self.
Here we are.
We may want to look at this for another event. So
Yeah, for sure.
yeah.
So just thank you, panel, for your thoughtful projects and your amazingly insightful responses, and deeply thank you for your work. So should we just go straight to Brad and have him wrap up rather than taking a break, or how would you like to roll this?
Absolutely. We're here. We're at 5:30.
Let's do it.
So let's you want to stay on with us? You're welcome to do our closing remarks. Before I turn it over to Brad, I want to once again thank the fantastic crew at the Heyman Center for their support, because this was undoable without you. And that includes Kay Shang. Oh my God, like that woman is. We got Grammy style notes, each and every one of us, as to how to proceed. And yes, Kay forever is the mantra going forward. And also Lindsay Scram and Chris Chang actually came and filled in as well. He's been fantastic. But really everybody at the Heyman Center has been wonderful. And thank you to our moderators, Seth Kluwitz and Diana Rodriguez, also for participating. It was so important to have Diana at the table. And of course, my biggest thanks to our wonderful presenters, Naomi Waltham-Smith, Lefray Sai, King Britt, Cristobal Martinez, Bonnie Jones, Abby Aristi, Hannah Kai, and Lauren Hayes. Sorry, Lefray I've been mispronouncing that. Each of you brings such thoughtful interventions to our field, and this event has given me a real boost and a moment of hope. In times that I feel like we really need it. You know, we're all really pushing against a lot of institutional forces, and I think it's gatherings like these that give us the fortitude that we need. And lastly, thank you to Columbia's Committee on Equity and Diversity at the School of Arts and Sciences, as well as Columbia's Music Department, and of course the Computer Music Center. And with that, Brad, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, yeah. So Suzanne asked me to, kind of give some closing remarks, like I can sum this up or something. I mean, that's just not going to happen. I mean, it was just a great conference, and I can't, really hold a candle to what our presenters have already said, And I have to thank Suzanne. We've been blessed here at the Computer Music Center to have a couple of really great things like this conference go on. Like last year, the Unsung Stories and this Kitchen Praxis, And it's because of people like Suzanne, people like Zasha De Castri, Eli Hisama, Ana Maria Ochoa. They're giving us the fire to do this. And there's an excitement as a result. I listening to this conference, it was just like, wow, we're doing some cool stuff. Well, we're not, we're just hosting the cool stuff. All of you are doing the cool stuff. But that's the good news. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the bad news. Suzanne kind of mentioned it just a minute ago about, the barriers for various things. Call it hegemony, call it white privilege, call it whatever you want. But there are things that are going on, and, fairly recent things. It's in her very first introductory remarks, Suzanne, I'm paraphrasing the quotes here because I was kind of writing them on the fly. Suzanne said, inclusiveness is not a problem of skill or capability. It's more the embedded social and cultural norms that are the problem. And that's it. That's exactly it, I have a couple of stories to tell you. this goes back to, the 1990s, I guess, mid 1990s, late 1990s, where I think it was Stanford organized it, but UCSD had a big buy-in, where they had this conference, and it was ostensibly about what do computer musicians need to learn, and it was, they were going to lay out what's required for responsible curricula and education at the higher education level. And I don't think there was a single female invited to the conference. Certainly there were no minorities that I recall. And I'm just thinking, boy, this is just wrong. And so much of it, I was looking at the stuff that was presented. I didn't go out to it. I was like, poor, that's good. And, I kept, they kept talking about, the tradition of this stuff. And every time I hear the tradition, red flags just go off because, here we go again. We're just going to reinscribe these kinds of, hegemonies and whatever. And, mark my words, you're going to be still facing this, all right? And like from the difference in belonging panel, Lefray said, we don't enforce Eurocentric standards of music. And Cristobal was talking about, I don't teach history at all. Those are strategies to combat this sort of thing. But I'm not making it up when I'm saying these are still, current issues. I don't know if many of you know what's happened. 2 days ago, there was an article in the New York Times about the Frankfurt, Germany opened their Museum of Modern Electronic Music. Very nice article saying, oh, wow, they're embracing pop music and techno and stuff like that. And it's going to be just this wonderful thing. Today, this morning, I read that, I don't know if you are aware of the group Female: Pressure. It's an arts activist group. And they wrote an open letter to the mayor of the city of Frankfurt, the magistrate of the city of Frankfurt, and Dr. Hartwig, the head of the Department of Culture for the city of Frankfurt. Because apparently in their museum, they don't acknowledge any of the blacktronic roots of techno music. Even though they have a big banner on the front page saying Black Lives Matter, there's nothing at all about the history of electronic music, especially techno, that references any of the work that was being done in Detroit, Chicago, New York, Frankfurt, other places. And apparently there's no women on the board. And this is just kind of wrong, and it becomes really crunchy because, we're talking about music technology, but let's be honest, everything in our world now is technologically mediated. We're here on Zoom. This is the future. So this kind of, being able to grapple with these issues is of utmost importance, So what do we do? How do we deal with this? I'm not just going to leave it at that and go, yeah, it's terrible. Bye. I have another story then to tell you is that I see a lot of what to do, what I do, what I try to do, what other people do through the filter of a book that I read back in the late 1980s. It was by this peculiar guy named Jacques Attali. He was President Mitterrand's Minister of Finance, of all things, and he wrote this slim volume called Noise, the Political Economy of Music. And his thesis in the book was that we had the freedom in music to experiment with different economic systems. And basically, it was in music that we could kind of create the economic systems of the future, free agency, guild society, unions, things like that. I don't think he went far enough. I think with music and music technology in today's world, we can experiment with the cultural and social things that Suzanne was talking about, that we can grapple with these and hopefully create new systems that will then take root in the wider world. That's my kind of, hope for, making my life relevant, making our lives relevant, to being able to shift the world towards something better. Now, I liked hearing Naomi Waltham-Smith's keynote address, and she quoted my good friend Ana Maria Ochoa about how recording tech has, helped promote colonization. And I thought, that there's a strong truth to that, but there's also, and you look at the work that Waltham-Smith herself has done, it can also be empowering, and it has to do, so my simple take on sort of confronting these issues in the future is kind of like two things. You know, I'm from Indiana, so I do simple takes all the time. The first one is, what do we do with the technology that we have? And the second one is, how do we do it? You know, and again, Waltham Smith is kind of an exemplar of that too. And going to the next panel, the difference in belonging stuff, you know, you saw a real strong set of examples of what to do and how to do it. You know, the phrase Sky, Cristobal, you know, King Britt, you know, they were all, you know, doing projects that were just outstanding exemplars of how to do things in this kind of inclusive way and promote that kind of ethos, you know. And then we saw a direct demonstration of that with Bonnie Jones and Suzanne Thorpe, you know, the idea of collaboration and hearing that marvelous piece. It was wonderful to hear at a music conference, actual music, Suzanne. So thank you for that. You know, and again, you know, this is how we work. This is how we can accomplish this inclusiveness, bringing people together, you know. And then finally, you know, the panelists on the access and accessibility, you know, they're just, to me, that's the future, you know. And there's something interesting about the work that they described, because it had to do with work within what I would call disciplines that are still not fully formed. You know, things that are kind of in the process of doing circuit bending, hardware hacking, you know, makers fairs and things like that. And here's my final little story. You know, Seth kind of mentioned this when he described our rewriting of all our course descriptions at Columbia. There's something I even noticed earlier, and it was very peculiar to me. We had an undergraduate class in techniques of electronic music. And we had kind of a mirror class at the graduate level in techniques of electronic music. The undergraduate class was called, you know, something like, you know, digital audio, introduction to digital audio. And the graduate class was called Introduction to Technological Composition. The inclusion of that word composition brought with it such a heavy hegemonic, heavy amount of baggage. And it played out in that we had 60% females and 20% BIPOC, people of color, Black, Indigenous in the undergraduate class. And we had like 0 to 1 females and no people of color in the graduate class. Just the inclusion of that word and what that word brought to the table, you know. So this idea that we can continue to work in these disciplines that are now being formed, hopefully we can gain the upper hand there. I talk about we, you know, it's us against the world, you know, but there's some truth to that, you know. And, you know, it's an uphill battle. I mean, look at Hannah Kai's stats about, you know, the teachers that were involved in sort of makers kind of education and things like that. You know, it's not where it should be. But you look at the projects that she's doing, look at what Abby's doing, Abby Aresti, look at what Lauren Hayes is doing and what they're describing. To me, that's the hope for the future, you know, and they're working with kids and we're working with students. And that's got to be one of the most profound missions that I can know of. So that's my summing up. I thank everybody for participating. This is a wonderful experience, and let's take this excitement and let's just go out and do stuff with it. There you go.
Thank you, Brad, and thank you again, everyone, for coming and participating. And I do earnestly hope that these conversations contribute to all your own practices and continue to be built on going forward. So thank you, everyone.